In this presentation, I'm going to talk about two parallel processes that can help to ensure that a blended course is effective. The first process is one that I'm sure you're already familiar with, but I'm still going to work through it because it will help to set the stage for the second process, which might be less familiar. The first process revolves around learning outcomes, and the second process revolves around instructional challenges. Let's start with the principles and assumptions of the first process. First, a well-designed course is one that aligns learning outcomes with learning activities and with assessments. Learning outcomes are simply what you want your students to be able to do or understand at the end of your course. Learning activities are the activities that your students will engage in to help them achieve their learning outcomes. Assessments are the means by which you, the instructor, will assess whether students have achieved their learning outcomes. And as I'm sure you know, assessments can take two forms. First, formative assessment, which provides feedback to the students so that they can improve or reform their learning. And second, summative assessment, which provides a grade to the student that contributes to their final mark in the course. Obviously, learning outcomes, learning activities, and assessments have to be aligned or congruent for a course to be successful. If they're not, then you'll end up expecting your students to learn X, they will actually learn Y, and you'll be assessing them for Z. Neither you nor your students will end up very happy. In a blended learning environment, you still need to align learning outcomes, learning activities, and assessments. But doing so is a bit more challenging because the learning activities can take place online or offline or both. To bring this all together, I'm now going to show you a single template that I created to help instructors align their learning outcomes, learning activities, and assessments in a blended environment. Additionally, the template encourages them to think about whether the learning activities should be online or offline, and it encourages them to think about how the online learning activities and the offline learning activities can be interwoven so that they support one another in a way that makes the course truly blended. Finally, the template invites instructors to think about whether a given assessment should be formative or summative in nature. So first of all, you'll see that this template has three main columns. One for learning outcomes, one for learning activities, and one for assessments. The fourth column simply lists some questions that instructors should ask themselves as they are working through the template. I'll get to that fourth column in a minute. Let's look a bit closer at the second column. You'll note that it asks whether the learning activity in question will be online or offline. Online simply means that it takes place in a learning management system or in some other cloud-based platform. Offline means that it takes place in the classroom or library or lab or some other traditional learning space. Now, in the assessment column, the instructor has two more choices, namely, to decide whether the assessment should be formative or summative or both. Here's the same template filled in with some examples for a course in Shakespeare. Let's start with the instructor's first learning outcome, which is this. Students will understand how Shakespeare mixes genres in his plays in order to create more complex works. The corresponding learning activity that the instructor has devised is this. In an online discussion group that will continue throughout the term, students will provide examples from each play where Shakespeare mixes genres. For example, where he puts comic elements into tragedy, serious elements into a comedy, realistic elements into a romance, and so on. Now, you'll note that the instructor has identified this as an online learning activity because it takes place in an online discussion group. Next, let's look at the assessment component. The instructor says that each student's contributions to the online discussion group will be assessed 3 times in the term. The first assessment will be only formative. That is, the assessment will only provide feedback. The second assessment will provide feedback and will be graded. The third assessment will be graded without feedback. This will account for 35% of the final grade. You'll note that the instructor has identified this assessment as both formative and summative. It's formative because the students do receive feedback, but it's also summative because they are eventually graded. Now let's look at the next learning outcome, because I want to emphasize how the offline and online components can build upon one another to create a truly blended course. So, the next learning outcome that is listed is actually the same as the previous learning outcome. Namely, students will understand how Shakespeare mixes genres in his plays in order to create more complex works. The associated learning activity this time, though, is an offline one, and it builds upon the previously noted online learning activity. It says, after studying each play, students will, in small groups, prepare a 10-minute presentation that summarizes the mixed genres in that play, and will offer some suggestions about why Shakespeare did so. Each week, 2 of those small groups will be chosen at random to present to the rest of the class. Clearly, students will be better prepared to successfully complete this offline small group project because of the foregoing online learning activity. The 2 learning activities, one online and one offline, build upon one another. Connecting the online and offline components of the course in this way is what helps to make it a truly blended course. A useful visual metaphor is that of the double helix that we associate with DNA. The 2 strands are not separate, but rather weave around one another and are joined by occasional crosslinks. Let's look at one final learning outcome that the instructor has articulated in this template. It says, students will understand the historical background of the Henriade tetralogy. That is, Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and Henry V. The associated learning activity that the instructor has devised is that students will watch 5 20-minute screencasts that the instructor has created and uploaded to the learning management system or YouTube. And the instructor's associated assessment is this. After viewing each screencast, students will complete a multiple choice quiz in the learning management system. Each quiz is worth 3%, meaning that the quizzes in total account for 15% of the final grade. Okay, by using this template to align learning outcomes, learning activities, and assessments, and by using it to ensure that online learning activities and offline learning activities build upon one another, and by using it to ensure that a good balance of formative assessment and summative assessment is achieved, an instructor should end up with a well-designed course. However, this process has left out an important element. Namely, it fails to recognize that in any course, there are always certain instructional challenges that hinder students as they strive to achieve the learning outcomes. Instructional challenges, as I define them, are anything that gets in the way of a student learning. Accordingly, instructional challenges can be cognitive in nature. For example, in a physics course, students might have misconceptions about some piece of course content, or they simply might find some theory very difficult to apprehend. Or instructional challenges can be motivational in nature. For example, students might consistently fail to prepare for class. Or instructional challenges can be social in nature. For example, students might not want to work in groups. Or instructional challenges can be systemic in nature. For instance, if students lack background knowledge for a course because they somehow skipped a prerequisite course, then that is a systemic instructional challenge. Over the past 7 years of working with faculty members at the University of Waterloo and at other universities in North America and abroad, I've identified a number of instructional challenges that seem to recur, and I've used them to create an inventory that instructors can complete online. I should add that I have several versions of this online inventory that vary according to their comprehensiveness. One of them includes pretty much every instructional challenge that I've come across. That is about 70 instructional challenges. However, a more manageable version is one that contains 16 instructional challenges that seem to be most common. It's online here, and by the way, I'll be sharing with you at the end of this screencast the links to all of the resources that I've developed. So, here is my instructional challenges inventory. As you can see, each instructional challenge is followed by a Likert scale. Let me read through each one of the instructional challenges so that you get a sense of what the inventory encompasses. First, my students come to class unprepared. Second, my students don't ask questions during class. Third, I have too many students to make in-class discussions feasible. Next, my students seem reluctant to participate in class discussions. Next, I don't have a sense of whether my students are keeping up or understanding the material. Next, some of my students seem reluctant to participate in online discussions. Next, some of my students dominate online discussions while others are left out. Next, some group members don't pull their weight. Next, I have too many students to make group work feasible during class. Next, my students seem bored in my classes. Next, my students don't seem interested in the course content. Next, my students have pre-existing misconceptions about the course content that interfere with their learning. Next, my students lack prerequisite or background knowledge for the course. Next, my students submit plagiarized work or cheat during tests and exams. Next, my students make little attempt to incorporate their feedback into subsequent assignments. And finally, I have so many students that it's not feasible to provide personalized feedback to all of them. When I work with faculty members, I often have them complete this inventory with a view to identifying the instructional challenges that are most hindering their students in a given course. The virtue of this inventory is that it gets instructors thinking about instructional challenges in an explicit way. Often, instructors will have an implicit awareness of what is preventing their students from learning as effectively as they might. But this inventory can bring that implicit awareness to the surface. Once the instructional challenges have been explicitly identified, it's much easier to develop strategies for resolving them. And that's what I'm going to move on to now by using a secondary process that is parallel to the one that I discussed earlier. For this secondary process, I've created a template that resembles the one we looked at earlier. The main difference is that the first column is devoted to instructional challenges rather than learning outcomes. The next column is for articulating a learning activity that will help to address the instructional challenge. And as with the previous template, the instructor is asked to consider whether that learning activity should be online or offline. The third column is for identifying an assessment that will determine whether students have actually overcome the instructional challenge or not. Moreover, it invites instructors to consider whether that assessment should be formative or summative. Let's now use this template to work through 3 instructional challenges for a course in Shakespeare. The first instructional challenge that the instructor identifies is this: students don't want to spend time learning the historical background that they need to fully understand Shakespeare's history plays, such as Richard II. The associated learning activity that the instructor has proposed to help resolve this instructional challenge is an online one. Specifically, it's this: working in small groups, students will use the synchronous collaboration feature of C-maps to create a concept map of the family tree of the Tudor royal family. That is, the royal family from 1485 to 1603. The associated assessment, which ensures that the learning activity does address the specified instructional challenge, is this. The concept maps are graded by the teaching assistant for the course. This accounts for 2% of the final grade. Moreover, because it does contribute to the final grade, the instructor has identified this as a summative assessment. Let's look at the next instructional challenge. Many students are consistently late for class. The associated learning activity, which is done offline, is as follows. At the beginning of every class, a brief quiz, 5 questions, based on content from the previous class is administered. Students respond to the quiz in class using clickers. The associated assessment is purely summative because the students receive no feedback, but the quizzes do contribute to the final grades of the students. Let's look at one more instructional challenge, namely, my students don't ask questions during class. The learning activity that the instructor has devised to address this instructional challenge is as follows. For each class, a Google Moderator session is set up which allows students to post questions online and to vote on each other's questions. The instructor or teaching assistant monitors these questions and responds to the ones that receive the most votes. Now, in terms of assessment, you'll see that the instructor has checked neither formative assessment nor summative assessment. I think that's the appropriate thing to do because, as the instructor has indicated, the questions posted in the Google Moderator session are not assessed either formatively or summatively. Google Moderator simply allows students another way of asking questions. The point I'm making here then is that while this template does prescribe a methodical process, an instructor doesn't need to follow it mechanically or mindlessly. It's simply a procedure or recommended workflow to help instructors identify instructional challenges and resolve them effectively. Lastly, let's look at the fourth column, which simply asks a few questions that an instructor should keep in mind as he or she works through the template. These questions include the following. How many hours will it take to develop the learning activity? In this case, the instructor has noted that it will take about 12 hours to develop the learning activity. The next question is, will it take less time to develop this learning activity if you use it again? In this case, the instructor has said yes, because the brief quizzes that are done at the beginning of each class can be reused the next time the course is taught. The next question is, how many hours will it take to do the assessments? The instructor has indicated 1 hour because clickers will allow the quizzes to be automatically graded and uploaded to the gradebook in the learning management system. The final question is, if this is a new learning activity, have you decreased the workload for students elsewhere? And to this, the instructor has answered yes. In short, we've looked at two parallel processes. The first process, which was probably familiar to you already, focused on ensuring that learning outcomes, learning activities, and assessments were all aligned with one another. It also highlighted the need for instructors in blended environments to think carefully about whether a given learning activity should be online or offline, and the importance of interweaving the online and offline components in a kind of double helix manner so that the course is truly blended. It also encouraged instructors to consider whether a given assessment should be summative or formative in nature, or both. The second process is one that is intended to supplement the first process. It focuses on identifying the instructional challenges that hinder students from learning in a course, and then creating another kind of alignment, one that aligns a given instructional challenge with a learning activity that will help to resolve it, and with an assessment that will discern whether that learning activity has been successful in resolving it. By using the templates to think through these two parallel processes, an instructor should be able to develop a very successful blended course. You're welcome to use or adapt the templates that I've developed, and also to use or adapt the instructional challenges inventory that I've developed.